Tim woke up to find Morag cooking some fish in a pan over the fire. Sebastian sat beside her watching everything she did. Sebastian was very hungry and he couldn't take his eyes off the fish. Aaron was pulling some potatoes out of the fire with a stick. Tim sat up. "What time is it?" he asked. "The sun is setting," said Morag. "The nightmares will be here before long." She set the pan down beside her. She lifted a fish out of it on a forked stick and set it down on a thin flat stone. She handed the stone to Tim and then lifted out 2 more fish, one for herself and one for Aaron. "Where did you get the fish?" asked Aaron. "I caught them in the stream at the foot of a hill," said Morag. "You were sleeping. Sebastian and I have been up for hours." Sebastian mewed hungrily. Tim broke the head and tail off his fish and gave them to Sebastian, and Aaron and Morag did the same. Sebastian ate them quickly, rubbed himself against Tim's leg, purred, and then jumped up onto a window ledge and down outside. When they'd finished eating, they tidied up the room, piling the bracken into the corner and setting the jug, the frying pan and the stones they'd used for plates beside the fire. Then they went down to the stream to wash in the fading light. The sun had gone and the stars were coming out. Tim was splashing the cold water from the stream over his face when Sebastian came running down the hill. "Arr!" he cried. "Arr!" Morag looked up. "There's someone coming," she said. "Quick, this way." She led the way into a patch of dead bracken and gorse bushes and crouched down so she couldn't be seen. Tim and Aaron crouched down beside her. Sebastian kept close to Tim. "Who is it?" whispered Aaron. Morag put one finger on her lip. "Stay here," she breathed. "Keep down and don't move. I'll go and see." The 2 boys stayed crouching in the dead bracken. Even Sebastian kept still. Morag moved away. She seemed to be able to slip through the bushes without making a sound. In a few minutes she was back. "It's one of the old ones," she whispered. "I didn't know they came as far south as this." "Who are the old ones?" asked Aaron. "Why must we hide from them? You said there'd be no enemies along the road." "Shh," breathed Morag. She spoke so softly they only heard the faintest of whispers. "The old ones have ears like foxes. I think they can hear a leaf fall. The old ones have lived in the country for hundreds and hundreds of years. They were here before the more people came, before the wind witches. There are not many of them, but their magic is very strong. Weirden the smith is one of the old ones. This is another, though I don't know his name. If he finds us here, he might stop us flying north. He mustn't find us." "But the nightmares will come back to the tower after sunset," Tim whispered softly. "He'll see them." "I know the nightmares will come," said Morag. "I must go and tell them. I know where to find them. We can't run away. The old one would hear us. He moves slowly, but he will stop us if he knows we're here. The nightmares are our only chance. The old one will go to the tower first. He will find that someone has been there and he will search the tower. He's very old. He won't hurry. Gives us a little time. You stay here and don't move. Don't make a sound. You mustn't even whisper. I'll come back for you with the nightmares. You must be ready to leap on their backs and fly the moment they are here." She moved silently into the bushes and was gone. Tim and Aaron settled down to wait. They were in the midst of a patch of gorse and bracken, and they could only see a little way around them. They didn't dare lift their heads out to look. Slowly it grew dark. Tim sat hugging his knees. He was getting cold and a bit stiff, but he daren't move. All his doubts about the journey were coming back to him. Sebastian, who'd been sitting by his feet, got up suddenly. The little cat stood for a moment listening. Then he slipped off into the bushes. He was back a moment or 2 later. He ran to Tim and gave an anxious little mew. Tim looked at Aaron. He jerked his thumb upwards to show that he was going to look out, and Aaron nodded his head. Very cautiously, Tim got on his knees and stretched up until he could see the tower and the hill through the bushes. He caught his breath. The dark figure of a man was coming down the hill towards them. He had a staff in his hand, and he moved slowly as if he was very old. But he was making straight for them. Tim dropped down again. "He's coming," he breathed. "We'll have to go." "But he'll hear us," whispered Aaron. "He'll see us too. What was that Morag said about stopping us? How could he do that? What does she mean?" "I don't know," said Tim, "but he'll be here in a few minutes." There was a cry above their heads. "Tim! Aaron!" It was Morag's voice. They leapt to their feet as the three nightmares swept down out of the sky. All three horses had gleaming silver bridles. Morag was riding one, and the other two flew beside her. The nightmares landed at the edge of a patch of bracken. Aaron scrambled up onto the back of one of them and flew up into the sky. The old man on the hillside lifted his staff and pointed it at Aaron. A ball of silver fire left the end of the staff like a cannonball fired from a cannon. It shot through the air towards Aaron and burst out over his head into a shining silver net. The net fell over Aaron. Aaron cried out. He lifted the edge of the net and threw it back over his head. The net fell to the ground in a shower of silver sparks. Aaron fell forward onto the mare's neck. Tim grabbed Sebastian and flung himself onto the back of the third nightmare as she struck off along the grass. By the time he struggled into a sitting position and grasped a bridle, he had caught up with the other two. "Aaron!" cried Tim. "Aaron!" Aaron lay forward on the horse's neck, his arms dangling down at each side. As Tim cried out, he tried to lift his head. He put one hand on his mare's mane and struggled up a little way and then fell forward again. Tim glanced back. The old man was still standing there on the dark hillside, but he showed no sign of sending another ball of silver fire after them. He was leaning on his staff, watching them fly off into the night sky. "We've got to come down," Tim cried to Morag. "Bring the horses down behind that hill. Can't you see Aaron's hurt? Bring the horses down." Morag said some words that Tim didn't understand, and the horses stretched out their wings and began to glide downwards. Tim was afraid that Aaron might fall, but he lay forward on the mare's back, and Tim could see that he had one hand gripping her mane. The nightmare's feet touched down on the grass, and they came to a stop near a little pool. Tim slithered off the mare's back and ran over to Aaron. "Aaron," he cried. "Aaron, how badly are you hurt?" I'm all right, Tim," whispered Aaron faintly, lifting his head a little. Tim held him as he slipped sideways off the horse's back and sank onto the ground. Tim knelt down beside him. He pulled off his own anorak and made it into a pillow for Aaron's head. Then he looked up and saw Morag standing beside him. "What is it?" he demanded. "What was that net in the ball of silver fire?" "It is the magic of the old ones," said Morag. "If Aaron had been one of the hidden people, or one of the strange ones, he would have fallen from the horse and been caught in the net of magic silver thread. It's a good thing the old man shot his ball at Aaron and not at me. Aaron is one of the ordinary folk. He's shaken now, but he'll be all right again in time. I should have been lying there by the tower in the power of the old one, but the ordinary folk can hold out against that kind of magic." "Where can we take him?" asked Tim. "We can't stay here. The old man may come looking for us." "We shall have to fly on," said Morag. "There's no shelter here for us, and I have no magic drink with me. We must fly to my people as quickly as we can. Then Aaron can rest in safety. My people will make a kind of drink from herbs and berries and roots, which will help him recover." Tim looked at Aaron. His eyes were open, and he was looking at Morag. His eyes moved slowly across to Tim. Tim bent forward. "Aaron," he said anxiously. "Aaron, how are you? Could you sit on the mare with me if I sat behind you and held you?" "I'll try," Aaron whispered. "I'm all right. I just feel weak." Morag and Tim lifted Aaron to his feet. They held him upright while Morag called one of the nightmares to come closer. Then, while Morag held Aaron, Tim put on his anorak and climbed onto the mare's back. With Tim pulling him up and Morag pushing from below, they managed to get Aaron in front of Tim. Tim put his arms around Aaron and held him firmly. Morag lifted the silver reins and put them into Tim's hands. Sebastian jumped onto Morag's shoulder and then onto the nightmare behind Tim. "Can you hold him?" asked Morag. "I think so," said Tim. Morag ran to Aaron's mare, took off the silver bridle and put it in a leather bag. Then she mounted her own mare. "Fly, nightmares, fly!" she cried, and the three horses ran across the grass and took off into the air. Even though it had no bridle and no rider, Aaron's mare flew beside the other two as they turned their heads towards a pole star and flew on their way northwards. Tim drew a long breath and settled down on the mare's back. "You all right?" he asked. "Yes," said Aaron. "I'm feeling better all the time. I'll be all right." Tim glanced across at Morag. She was riding quietly a little ahead, and now and then she turned and looked backwards towards the hill behind them. Morag had said there would be no enemies on the road. If the old one they had just escaped from wasn't an enemy, thought Tim. He was so like one that he wondered what the difference was. Tim wondered what lay ahead of them too, on the moors in the islands of the north. He tried to stop himself thinking about it. It was no good worrying. You had to take things as they came when you were working for the hidden people. Tim had learnt that. And just at that moment, all he cared about was getting to the moor people as quickly as possible so they could help Aaron. If Aaron was really alright, nothing else mattered. But if he wasn't, Tim wouldn't let himself think about it. The moon came up over the hills. It was nearly a full moon now. The silvery light shone down, and Tim saw a great lake below them with high hills all around it and islands in the lake. He shivered a little. Below them the country grew wilder and stranger. There were mountains and great stretches of moorland with no sign of a village or even a farmhouse. Tim could see great rocks below, and sometimes the moon shone down on more lakes and islands. Aaron was sitting very still, but he seemed to be holding himself up more and more as time went on. He wasn't leaning back against Tim as hard. Tim felt a little happier. At last the nightmares began to sweep down towards the hills. The moon was still in the west, but the first faint light was beginning to show in the east on the edge of the sky. The nightmares turned westward towards the moon, and in the distance Tim could see the sea. Then they were flying low over the moor into a wild valley between the hills. They flew along the valley towards a cliff by a stream. The nightmares touched down at the foot of the cliff and stood quietly there on the grass. "We're here," said Morag, slipping to the ground. She ran across to the boys. "Aaron," she asked. "Aaron, how are you?" "I'm getting better," said Aaron. I'll be all right." "The ordinary folk are wonderful people," said Morag. "Can you get down?" The nightmare seemed to understand that Aaron needed help. She dropped her head downwards so that he was able to swing one leg round over her head and slide off her back. Morag stood by the mare, and Aaron slid one arm across her shoulders. She gripped him round the waist and held him up until Tim dropped down to the ground beside him and took her place. Sebastian jumped down beside them. Morag ran to the two nightmares they had been riding and took off their silver bridles. "Fly, nightmares, fly!" she cried. "Fly to your caves before the sun comes." The three nightmares spread their wings. Aaron and Tim stood watching them as they flew up into the moonlight and away over the dark hills. Morag came back to the two boys. "Sit down, Aaron," she said. "Don't try to walk. Sit down where you are and I'll bring some of my people here to help you. We're close to one of our caves." Tim helped Aaron to sit down on the dry heather. Morag turned and made her way towards the stone face of the cliff which rose up near them. There was a rowan tree growing by the cliff. Morag walked up to it. "Open now, stone door, by the magic rowan tree. I am Morag of the moor. Open now to me," she cried. A crack showed in the cliff. As Tim and Aaron watched, a great stone in the shape of a big door swung outwards, leaving a dark hole in the cliff. Morag stepped through and was gone. A few minutes later she was back again, bringing some of the moor people with her. There were 3 men and a woman. In the early dawn light the boys could see they were dressed in tunics, like Morag, long soft boots tied to their legs with thin straps of leather. The woman had a blue cloak hanging from her shoulders. She came over and bent towards Aaron. "How are you?" she asked softly. "Can you still feel the pain of the net?" "A bit," said Aaron, "but I'm all right. I just feel very weak." The woman nodded her head. "It's a wonderful thing you are here," she said. "I have never known anyone escape from an old one's net, but then I've never known one of the ordinary folk who could see hidden people before. Don't try to get up. We'll carry you into our cave. Your strength will come back." She turned to one of the men. "Take the boy in," she said. The man smiled at Aaron. "Come then," he said. Tim helped Aaron to his feet, and the man picked him up in his arms and carried him through the stone door into the cave. Tim and Sebastian followed with the others. Morag came last. When she was inside, Tim heard her call out in a clear voice, "Close now, stone door by the magic rowan tree. I am Morag of the moor. Close door after me." The stone door swung silently shut behind them. They found themselves moving through a dark cave towards an opening lit by torches beyond it. Tim followed the others through the opening and found himself in a great cave. Big iron lanterns hung from brackets in the walls, and at each end a great fire was burning in a big stone fireplace underneath some kind of chimney. A dark tunnel going upwards into the hall that carried the smoke away. At one end of the hall 3 round tables were set for a meal. There were 12 wooden stools round each table. There were big chairs made of wood set in a great circle at the other end of the cave. These all had leather backs, and their arms were carved in the shape of animals, foxes and deer and dolphins, and some other creatures Tim did not recognise. "Carry the boy through to the traveller's room," said the Moor woman who had spoken to Aaron. The man crossed the great cave with Aaron in his arms and entered a passage on the far side. Tim was following when Morag put a hand on his arm. "Stay here," she said. "Aaron will be all right now." "I must see where he's going," Tim said. Morag dropped her hand, and Tim followed the Moor woman and the man into the passage, with Sebastian trotting along at his heels. The others stayed in the hall. The man led the way down a long passage. The passage was lit by lanterns hanging from the roof rock. There were doorways opening off on each side of it. Woolen curtains hung across the doorways so that Tim couldn't see what lay behind them. The man stopped at one of the curtains. The woman pulled it aside, and the man carried Aaron through the opening into a little room. The room was lit by a lantern which stood on a wooden table beside a wooden bed covered in sheepskins. A fire was burning in this room too, under a dark hole in the rock which led upward into the hill. The Moorman laid Aaron down on the bed and covered him with a thick woolen blanket. He turned to Tim and smiled. "Don't be afraid," he said. "He will be all right now. We shall care for him as we would one of our own people." "I'll be fine," said Aaron. "You must lie down and rest," said the woman who had come in behind them. "I will bring you something to drink, and then you must sleep. We have a drink which we make from fruit and herbs, which will help you to go strong again." The man turned to Tim. "You can leave him here safely," he said. "You will be needed in the council in the great cave." "Are you sure you're right?" Tim asked Aaron. "I'm fine," said Aaron. "I'll soon be up." "All right," said Tim. "See you later." They left Aaron resting on the bed. Tim and Sebastian the Moorman went back to the great cave, and the woman went off into the hill to make the drink for Aaron. When they got back to the great cave, they found the Moor people sitting in the chairs in the big circle waiting for them. 2 of the chairs were empty. Tim and the Moorman went across to them and sat down. Tim looked round the circle. There were about 30 of the Moor people, men and women, sitting on the chairs. Morag was the only younger one there. She was sitting on a stool beside a tall man with white hair and a white beard, who appeared to be the leader of the Moor people. He wore a circle of silver rather like a crown on his head. There were silver buckles on his belt and a heavy silver chain set with blue stones hung around his neck. As soon as Tim had sat down, he turned to him. "I am Madron, Lord of the Moor," he said in a deep voice, "and I welcome you to our cave and our council." Tim couldn't think of anything to say, so he sat quite still looking at Madron. "I am sorry your friend has been hurt," Madron went on after a moment's pause. "You need not fear for him. You can leave him with us, and we shall look after him well." Tim swallowed hard, but still he said nothing. "You cannot wait for him," said Madron, speaking directly to Tim. "There is no time to be lost. My granddaughter Morag has told you that Weirden the smith is making iron men to drive us from our lands. Even while she has been away, another Iron Man has landed on the shore. You are one of the ordinary folk. You are strong against the magic of the old ones. We have seen that now with our own eyes. Your friend Aaron threw off the silver net, and he is safely here with us. None of us can escape from the silver net of the old ones. Tonight, the moon will be full. We will take you down to the shore. Weirden's island is across a narrow channel. We have a boat hidden in a cave on the shore. 2 of us will take you across to the island in the boat. At the same time, I shall lead a force of men up onto the headland where the people of the Moonlight are. The people of the Moonlight will be holding one of their ceremonies there by the light of a full moon. We shall attack. The Iron Men may be there to guard them. If they are, we shall not be able to drive them back, but we shall attack as strongly as we can, with clubs and slings for stones. Weirden is bound to come for their help, and that will give you your chance. You must go into the smithy in the tower on the island as soon as Weirden has left. It will be guarded by a silver curtain hanging across the entrance, but that is nothing to you. You are one of the ordinary folk, and we have seen that a silver net could not stop you. Weirden's hammer will be there in the smithy. Bring it back here to our cave. Morag will wait here to open the stone door. You must be as quick as you can. Once Weirden himself has come, we shall be driven back off the headland. We shall come back to the cave and meet you there." "What if there are Iron Men on the island?" asked Tim. "Once you have a hammer you will have no fear," said Madron. "If you strike an Iron Man with Weirden's hammer, he will crumple up and die. The Iron Men are made with a hammer, and once Weirden magic has brought them alive, they cannot stand against it." "Can they go through the silver curtain?" asked Tim. "Yes," said Madron. "Weirden has given that power, and they can draw the silver curtain back." "Will you go, Tim? It may be dangerous, but we need your help. Only you can get the hammer for us." "I'll try and get the hammer," said Tim. "Morag helped me once when I went to the stone prisons. I don't know if I can manage to get the hammer for you, but I'll try." "Then you must sleep now," said Madron. "We must all rest and be ready for tonight. Morag will show you where to sleep. We will meet here again at sunset." He got to his feet, and the others stood up too. "This way, Tim," said Morag, leading the way across the great cave to the passage. Tim and Sebastian followed her down it, and she stopped by one of the woolen curtains. She pulled it to one side, and Tim followed her into a little room. There was a bed in the room covered with sheepskins, with a table beside it and a wooden chair. There was no fire in this room, but a candle was burning on the table. "Lie down on the bed and get some sleep," said Morag. "I'll call you when it's time to get up." "I want to see Aaron before I go," said Tim. "Call me in lots of time." "I will," said Morag. "Don't worry, Tim. Aaron will be all right, and so will you." "I hope so," said Tim. "Leave a candle burning." He took off his anorak, kicked off his shoes and lay down. A thick woolen rug lay folded across the foot of the bed, and Tim pulled it up over himself. "I'll bring you something to eat," said Morag. She left the room and was soon back with some bread and cheese and a mug full of milk. "Here you are," she said. "I'll be back at sunset." She left the food and milk on the wooden table and disappeared through the doorway. Tim shared the bread and cheese with Sebastian. Sebastian wouldn't have any of the milk, so Tim drank it all himself. He thought afterwards there must have been something in the drink, because no sooner had he finished it than tiredness swept over him like a wave. He set the mug down, closed his eyes, and fell asleep. Tim woke to find Morag beside his bed. She was shaking his shoulder, and Sebastian was standing on his feet. He opened his eyes and sat up. "The sun is just setting, Tim," said Morag as soon as she saw he was awake. "Come along to the great hall. We are having supper there before we set out. We shall be up all night." "I'll be there in a minute," said Tim. Morag disappeared through the doorway. Tim looked round. Morag had set a basin full of water on the table by his bed, and a towel lay beside it. He scrambled out of bed. He hadn't taken his clothes off before he lay down, so he had no need to dress. He put on his shoes and washed his hands and face in the water. It was very cold, but it made him feel much wider awake. He picked up his anorak and went down the passage to the traveller's room. Aaron was lying there still fast asleep. He was breathing quietly and he looked better. Tim slipped away without waking him and went back along the passage to the great hall with Sebastian at his heels. The Moor people were sitting at the tables eating supper. There was an empty chair between Madron, the lord of the Moor people, and Morag. As soon as she saw him, Morag beckoned to him, and he went across to her and sat down. There were dishes of fish on the table and some kind of meat stew. There were loaves of brown bread and dishes of butter and cream and some kind of jam made from berries. The dishes were passed around and everyone helped themselves. "How long will Aaron be ill?" Tim asked Morag as he took some of the stew. "He's not ill," she said. "He's only weak. He will be himself again in a few days' time. He'll feel much better when he wakes. He's still asleep." "I know," said Tim. "I went along to his room." "Don't wake him," said Morag. "He won't be strong enough to come with you tonight." "I know that," said Tim. "I won't wake him." He put some fish on a plate and set it down on the floor for Sebastian. The lord of the Moor people pushed back his chair and stood up. At once there was silence. "It is time for us to go," said Madron. "I shall lead a party of men up to the headland. We shall light fires there and attack the people of the Moonlight with flaming torches. That will bring Weirden across from his island to defend them. As soon as he has landed and made his way up the cliff, Tim must set out for the island. Dronach, you will be in charge of a boat. Dunlin will go with you. You will land in the little cove below the tower and wait there in the boat hidden among the rocks while Tim goes up to Weirden's tower and brings back the magic hammer." You will bring the hammer back to the Star Rocks, where we shall be waiting for you, or back here to the cave, if the Iron Men have driven us from the headland." He turned to Tim. "You can see Weirden's tower from the shore," he said. "You will find yourself close to the foot of the tower as soon as you climb out of the cove. Weirden's smithy is in the tower. There's an old wooden door into the tower with an iron lock. For that lock, we have a key. But there is a silver net, a curtain on one side of the door which we cannot pass. You can. Pull the curtain aside and go into the tower. You will find the hammer there in the smithy. Here is the key to the tower." He handed Tim an old iron key. Madrin pushed back his chair. "Give us half an hour, then go down to the shore," he said to Dronach. All the men except Dronach and Dunlin pushed back their chairs and went over to a pile of wooden torches which lay on one side of the hall. They each made of pine and were all ready to be set alight. Each man took a torch and each man carried a heavy club. They went quietly out of the hall with their leader towards the door in the cliff. The two men who had been left behind came over to Tim. "We'll meet you here in half an hour," said a man called Dronach. "The boat is all ready in the cave on the shore." Tim nodded. Dronach dropped his hand on Tim's shoulder for a moment. "Don't be afraid," he said. "We shall be back here safely before morning." "I'm not afraid," said Tim. "At least, if I'm afraid, it won't stop me going." "That is all that matters," said Dronach. The two men left the hall. "Finish your supper," said Morag. "You'll need it before the night is over, and there's plenty of time." Tim had only just begun his stew, and he was hungry. He had said he wasn't afraid, but he was feeling rather scared. He was sure that landing on Weirden's island and stealing his magic hammer would be a good deal more difficult than it sounded. He would have to do it in the dark and in the moonlight, and he didn't know who or what he might find on the island. His hand shook a little as he helped himself to the brown bread and cream. Sebastian finished his fish and jumped onto Tim's knee, purring. At least Sebastian wasn't afraid. He seemed to be enjoying himself. Morag stayed with Tim while he finished his supper and then went to take another look at Aaron. But Aaron was still sleeping, so they made their way back to the Great Hall. Tim hated having to wait. He kept thinking of all the things which might happen, and he felt more and more scared. He was thankful when at last Dronach and Dunlin appeared. Once they had started, he knew that he would feel better. "Does the cat come with us?" asked Dronach, looking at Sebastian. "He always goes with me," said Tim. Dronach shrugged his shoulders. "I'm coming too, as far as the cove," said Morag. Dronach nodded. "That is what your grandfather said," he answered. He led the way out of the hall to the great door. Morag used the same spell to open it she had used before, and she closed it after them. The moon was behind them, shining very brightly, and their black shadows moved in front of them. They made their way down, following the path among the rocks and climbing over boulders. There was a long point running out into the sea on their left, and great cliffs to their right leading out to the headland. A little cove lay between the 2 points. They could hear the cries of the moor people more clearly now, and they saw the light of the bonfires on the headland, and now and then a flaming torch. Then they dropped lower and lower towards the sea, and could no longer see anything except the edge of the cliffs above. "Do you see the great rocks in the sea?" whispered Dronach. "The ones below the headland. Those are the Star Rocks, and look, there is Weirden's island." Weirden's island lay out to sea ahead of them, just off the headland beyond the Star Rocks. It wasn't very far away, it wasn't a very big island, and Tim could see the stone tower at one end standing out against the sky. They had just reached the sands when Dronach, who was leading the way, lifted a hand. "Quick, hide," he whispered sharply. He dropped down beside some rocks on the sands to their left, and the others followed him. "What is it?" whispered Tim. "Weirden is leaving the island," whispered Dronach. "Keep down and follow me behind the rocks. He's coming this way." They followed Dronach, creeping along the sand, keeping to the cliffside of the rocks for a few hundred metres. Then they stopped and cautiously looked out between 2 boulders. A boat was making for the shore. Tim could see that there were 2 men in it. One was pulling on a pair of oars, and the other sat in the stern. The boat came in. The man at the oars pulled them in, and then jumped out into the breaking waves. He pulled the boat up on the sand, with the other man still sitting in the back of it. Tim knew that he must have the strength of 10 men to be able to do that. "That is Weirden himself," breathed Dronach. "But who has he got with him?" As he spoke, Weirden said something, and the man sitting in the boat got to his feet. He climbed stiffly out of it and stood on the sand. Tim caught his breath. The second man was made of iron. The moon shone down brightly on him, and Tim could see him clearly. His face, his arms and legs were made of iron. He was dressed like a Spaniard in times gone by hundreds of years ago, but his dress was all iron, and he had an iron hat on his head, and a short iron cloak hung from his shoulders. He held a sword in his hand as he moved. Tim heard the clank of metal. Weirden said something to the Iron Man, but the wind carried his words away. The Iron Man stood on the sand beside the boat. Weirden turned and made his way up towards the path they had just come down. They waited behind the rocks, not daring to move, as he passed by the rocks and began to climb up the valley. In a few minutes, Weirden was out of sight in the darkness. "What do we do now?" whispered Tim. "No one thought of Weirden coming this way," breathed Ronag. "He has always gone to the end of the headland. There are steps up the cliff there." "Well, he's here now," said Tim. "We can't get to our boat with the Iron Man on the shore," said Dunlin, "not unless we fight him." "And you know as well as I do that two more people cannot fight one Iron Man," said Ronag. "Why did he take the Iron Man with him?" asked Morag. "He'll need him to fight for the headland." "He must have enough Iron Men on the headland already," said Ronag. "It will be a fierce fight up there. He's left the man to guard his boat and the shore while he goes to fight for the people of the Moonlight and to command his Iron Men to fight against us. And in the meantime we can't get to our boat, so Tim can't go over to the island." Said Sebastian. There was a long stick lying on the shore and he ran over to it. "Course!" cried Morag. "Sebastian's a strange one. He can carry you across on a broomstick. We'll get one from the cave. Come, we must get back up the cliffs without the Iron Man seeing us. You can fly from our cave as well as you can from the sands if you're flying on a broomstick." "I don't think the Iron Man will leave the cove, even if he does see us," said Dunlin. "He's been left here to guard Weirden's boat and to stop anyone else taking a boat out. He won't leave." "We'll keep hidden if we can, just the same," said Ronag. "This way, follow me." They made their way back towards the stream, keeping behind the rocks. They scrambled up behind some bushes and onto the path leading to the valley. They looked back from time to time towards the sea, but the Iron Man had not moved. He still stood there by the boat on the sands, and they did not know whether he had seen them or not. It didn't seem very long before they were back at the great door into the cliff. "Wait here," said Morag. She whispered the spell, the door opened and she slipped inside. "I don't like you going over to the island without us," said Ronag. "That was not the plan." "I'll have to," said Tim. "It's the only way. Sebastian can't take you on a broomstick too, especially if I had to carry a heavy hammer back. His magic isn't strong enough." "I still don't like it," said Ronag. Morag came running back with a broomstick in her hands. "Here you are," she said. "You haven't lost much time because you'll be much quicker on a broomstick." She put it on the ground. "Off you go, Sebastian," she said. "Fly as low as you can so that no one sees you going to the island and coming back too." Sebastian flicked his tail. The broomstick lifted up a little way above the ground. He jumped onto the end and looked at Tim. "Arr," he said. Tim sat down on the broomstick and gripped it with his hands. "All set, Sebastian. Go off to the left first and then down to the sea and out to the island. Don't go through the valley. I want to get to the island without being seen if I can." "Arr," said Sebastian. He waved his tail and the broomstick started with a jerk. They flew low over the rocks and heather away to Tim's left, up the side of the valley and out over the moor.